I'm going to turn this over to my partner in crime, Elizabeth Moeller, and let her introduce our guest speaker. And she'll be joined by Elizabeth Novak, also a programs coordinator with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, to ask some questions at the end. Over to you, Liz.
Great, thank you so much. So Leah Riddell is a bilingual deaf entrepreneur who owns Signable Vision Incorporated that teaches individuals, small businesses, and corporations inclusive strategies for communication. Leah provides services and training that empower businesses to create a deeper, more inclusive client experience. Through personal experience, she educates that communication is not one way, and it's not always listening and speaking. What sets her apart from others is her personal story of being faced with a lack of accessibility and stepping up to solve this widespread problem. Her struggle is her superpower. She does it in a way that's fun and approachable. Leah is a consultant, trainer, and sign language interpreter, and she's an advocate for inclusion. She strives for access for all and a situation where everyone wins. So welcome, Leah.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Lisa, for inviting us today. I am very honored to be here and have an honest conversation for the community and employers and for hiring. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And you see the interpreters on screen. Maybe you've never experienced interpreters before, and you might think they're here for me, but in actuality, they're here for you. So there might be a little bit of lag time because there's time for the interpreters to listen to the source language and then change it into the language that they are producing. Yeah, come on. There we go. So my business is Signable Vision, and I established my business or cooperated over the summer, and it's been going for a while. And the purpose is to provide services, whether one-on-one, private, or every quarterly lessons, can provide some instruction for individuals as well. For small businesses, I also provide courses for that. And I also do corporate presentations, training, and so forth. I also teach ASL for all. I also do some sign art, as you can see in some of my slides. So this image is a drawing of a Black woman signing the word culture. So when you think of learning a new language, a new oral language specifically, you also learn about that country, their culture, the people, and it's from a byproduct of learning the language. As well, deaf people have culture, they have linguistics, they have common life experiences, which has become a deaf culture. And this includes beliefs, attitudes, the history, the social norms, social values, as well as literacy and traditions. There's lots of art that is shared, that is created by deaf individuals. Canada alone has about 6 signed languages that I'm aware of, as well as many Indigenous signed languages. There's ASL, which is American Sign Language, LSQ, our langue signe québécois. There's Oneida Sign Language here in Ontario. There's also sign language from Nunavut, There is Maritime Sign Language out east. There's pro-tactile signing, and I'm sure there's more that is utilized across Canada. If the spoken language is official, why not a signed language? Oh, yeah. But either, regardless, spoken or signed, they should both be considered equal. And deaf people don't just learn one language, we actually learn a signed language as well as the spoken language. So we are bilingual. There are many reasons why we would like the equality in languages. It's not that we are trying to force anybody to learn or use the language, but there are benefits for everyone, whether once you know a sign language. So the deaf community or deaf culture is the heart of the deaf communities worldwide. Each deaf community is a cultural group which shares sign languages and a common heritage. So this is, sorry, and I forgot to mention that the image on the slide is that of an image of a laptop. Members of deaf communities around the world therefore identify themselves as members of a cultural and linguistic group. Identification within the deaf community is a personal choice and is usually made independent of the individual's hearing status. And the community is not automatically composed of all people who are deaf and hard of hearing. The community may also include family members of deaf individuals, sign language interpreters, people who work with deaf individuals or who have hired deaf workers. As a person is a member of the deaf community if they self-identify as such, and if the other members accept them as a member. Often this acceptance is very strongly linked to a competence in a signed language. People often ask what's the best term that they should use. We typically use the word deaf with a capital D to represent all levels of deafness. Some people have a need to add other variations, such as hard of hearing. That could be a person that can speak and or use some sort of audiological device. And there may be deaf individuals who identify, or other individuals who identify themselves as deaf, even if they are able to utilize devices. As well, there's deafblind, there's deafened, which means somebody who was born with the ability to hear and at some point in their life later lost that ability, such as senior citizens. We don't often use the term hearing impaired. That is much more of a medical term, which implies that there's something wrong with the individual, that they are not seen as a whole person. So I often use the capital D, deaf, to represent everyone regardless of their hearing status. During presentations and trainings, I will use deaf, but that word is being inclusive of all individuals within that realm. Deaf people's experiences are different. Some are able to utilize devices to hear some noise, but these are tools. They are not a cure for deafness. It supports the sense of taking in auditory stimulus. Some deaf people might be not able to hear a whisper, but could hear a conversation, or maybe just hear a machine running. Maybe you could hear a conversation one-on-one, but as soon as it's a group, it's very difficult to follow. It's important to consider as well the background noise. And if it's noisy, you might need to move to another location where it's more quiet and it's more suitable or conducive to conversation. Lip reading is far from perfect. Some sounds and words look very similar, so you sort of have to guess at what word is being used. And again, it depends very much on the individual and trying to figure out their mouth patterns, their background, their language experience. For myself, if I'm with a new individual I've never met before, I'm not sure of their speech patterns, so I have to meet them a few times to get used to them. But again, if you have mustache, any facial hair at all, and the masks right now create a very large barrier to communication through lip reading. The range of proficiency for skill reading is 60 to 20%, and that is often more to the lower end. About 35% of communication in that situation is guesswork. From their body language, from what the context is, I think the word might be this. That is a skill that's forced on children as they're growing up, and they're trained and they must practice on a daily basis. You have to interpret the mouth movements, the facial movements, what the tongue is doing. It's challenging. And it's more of a challenge because the auditory sounds are not accessible to the deaf individual. Listening with a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, speech reading is very fatiguing, and that fatigue is very real. I experience it if I go to an event or something where I have to chat, even for just an hour, I'm burnt out and completely spent afterwards. Again, depending on individuals and what they are able to tolerate. Just a word of caution, the best approach is to ask the individual what their preferred term is. And you do not to say, hi, I'd like you to meet my deaf employee. I want you to meet this deaf person. Maybe they don't want everyone to know, or maybe they want the opportunity to provide that themselves. So allow that person to give you that preferred title and allow them to identify. So this is an image of a man in a wheelchair, and it's captioned sign language, a language with a question. Sign language does have its own grammar, which is much different than spoken language. Sign language uses hand shapes, positions, movements, body movement, as well as gestures and other visual cues. All of that becomes the sentence structure. Other languages have proficiencies, and it does take a long time to study and practice. It is something that can be learned. I mean, you don't need to be proficient, but to know a few basic things to be able to communicate is all that would be necessary. Sign language is 70% visual, the body movements and body positioning. It's only 30% that is on the hands. As you learn ASL, you'll understand that even more. Sign language is separate and distinct from English. It has all the fundamental features of language. It has its own rules for pronunciation, word formation, and order. Sign language has a variety of different functions and how you would indicate that. So how you would ask a question. So in English, you start with what. In ASL, the what is actually at the end. For example, in English, you would say, or you would raise your voice at the end of a question, whereas in ASL, we furrow our brows. We use the facial expressions to indicate a question. And the body is also tilted forward as you move your eyebrows. Many people, and I have seen it often, they make assumptions about somebody being an angry deaf person because their eyebrows are furrowed and they're looking more into the person. However, it's the visual function of our language. It's part of our language. It's not that we're angry, we're just asking a question. It's just part of our language. You don't have to run away from us. Just hold on a moment. Find out what we need. You're safe. Don't worry. As with other languages, there's specific ways of how to express your ideas, the same in sign language. And as those approaches vary according to the sign language users themselves. There's the individual differences, but there are also regional accents and dialects, just as some English words are spoken differently in different parts of the country. Eastern Canada, Ontario, Western Canada have some very different signs. There's some similarities, even amongst the US, there are some similarities, but there are a lot of differences as well. There's a variation on rhythm, on pronunciation, slang, and the signs that are used. There's other sociological factors as well, including age and gender, that can affect sign language usage and contribute to the variety, just as it does with spoken language. So this is an illustration of two men. One's an employee, one's a customer trying to communicate with them through a phone, and the employee is reacting like a deer in the headlights. Entitled barriers. I've seen it often that comes up in relation to accessibility for deaf individuals when they're going to get a job. People assume that this language difference is either going to become a burden or it will be too expensive to hire an interpreter. That opportunity is then sunk for the deaf individual who's looking for a job. They've never had an opportunity for an interview. Maybe they only need the interpreter once for an interview or periodically. They don't need an interpreter with them all the time. There's other communication modalities that can be applied. Deaf experience discrimination constantly when they try to work because the employer doesn't want to provide the access, or they don't think that the deaf person would be able. So often deaf people will hide their deafness. They won't put it on their resume until they actually show up to the interview. And I've done that. I worked for different deaf organizations. I removed deaf from my resume and I got an interview right away, which was rather interesting to experience. Hiring management often see disability as a weakness or something to take advantage of. I've gone through that experience as well. There's often the evidence that you're or they often view that as evidence that you are unproductive, which is a very incorrect assumption. Coworkers often expect deaf people to be able to process knowledge and communicate as quickly as someone with normal hearing. That assumption can often, when that proves wrong, the deaf employee might be seen as incapable or lacking in intelligence, which means that it's easy to take advantage of that coworker or discriminate against them, and also could potentially lead to poor job evaluations, which isn't fair. And I've gone through that where I had limited training opportunities where my hearing coworkers had access to them. No person should feel to be made to feel as though they're an inconvenience, or they shouldn't feel thrilled that they were able to access that other members of the population had already access to. There should be equal access to that information. Obviously, something needs to change in this world to make it a more welcoming place for members of the deaf community. Customer service industries and employees should learn some sign so that they have the ability to sign and have basic etiquette for their workplace, so that they can then communicate with their peers or potential customers. Honestly, you shouldn't be surprised to know that sign language has benefits for everybody, not just the deaf communities. Maybe something so simple as I'm hungry, you can easily communicate it to somebody across the room, your needs. My clients that I have taught, they can definitely tell you that they have benefited from learning basic sign language. The most common errors when I'm helping to work with a deaf employee is people freeze up, or they look like that deer in the headlights. They don't know what to do. They're not sure how to communicate, so they're fumbling to find paper and pen to write back and forth. They're not prepared. And it's trying to pass somebody off to another colleague or a manager because they don't want to deal with that situation. Or if you're working with another hearing person, the deaf employee is often left out and not included. Or some sign, but you're just chatting, so it's not the best to learn while you're working. You need a proper place for that. So it's just for staff to have basic sign and sign etiquette. As deaf people, we have grown up and learned how to accommodate others, but where is the turnaround in that? Most issues and difficulties could easily be remedied if employers would just communicate with their staff. You may learn so much from that individual that you might not be aware of. You just need to communicate. They may have great ideas that could improve your business. I'm sure there's several deaf employees that would have great ideas for that. Well, just let me check the time. What time is it? Woo, I'm running out of time. Okay. Hopefully the interpreter can catch up as I go too fast. This illustration is of a man signing first. So the first steps is an assessment. Typically, I go into the workplace and I'll observe and evaluate the interactions with the staff. The second part is then the consultation. I'll show the employers, what they're doing well and provide feedback for how they could improve in other areas. And there may be common vocabulary for that environment. So just providing those sorts of feedback points. The third part is that I coach. So I can provide or run scenarios where I show you and your employees how to communicate with any peers or customers successfully. And then if there's time, I do have activities for a little bit later to show the process. So in the meantime, what do you do? So this is a signed illustration of a woman signing to do or do. You could take inclusive communication training for your staff. It comes down to an awareness of how we communicate with people every day, exchanging information in a ways that allows everyone to belong. And it could be language for admin, etc. Provide friendly signage for all. And I've done that for a construction company where I showed the sign for helmet, but then had a sign language to show how you would sign it. It would show the different safety components. Have QR codes, etc., as well as online materials. A lot is for captioning as well. Provide accessible videos with having sign language, having transcripts. This is an illustration of different ways of how to communicate. So important at the top is eye contact. There's sign language. And again, you don't have to be proficient in sign language, but to know important words to be able to express to coworkers. Could provide interpreters for team meetings, those sorts of things. Gesturing, texting. You can also use voice to text. And there's always writing back and forth with good old pen and paper. So on that image, there's different icons to represent each of those ideas. I have 6 of the top communication tips next, and I will go through and explain them all. Always face the person. Make sure you have eye contact. Some people who may have autism don't like eye contact, but have your body language show that you're listening, and that should be proficient. Don't cover your mouth or face. Keep that clear. Make sure that the noise level and the lighting is appropriate. You might need to move to a quieter place or to where there's a more appropriate lighting. And make sure, like with the lighting on a virtual platform, that the lighting is consistent across the face and not too dark or too bright. For distancing, and I'm not talking about the 6 feet distancing for COVID, but you do need a little bit of space between yourself and the deaf individual you're speaking to. Just a little bit, 1 to 2 feet, just so you could see each other clearly. Speak clearly and slowly. Don't go through things too fast. Give the individual time to speech read you and process what you're saying. And take turns. Don't give all the information. Give some time. Let the person lip read, or if they're going through an interpreter, make sure they have time to process the information. So give them time to process that information and be able to respond to you. Repeat or rephrase if necessary. and they may have missed one word, so you just might need to change that one word, and then it will be understood. Really smile, be positive, have that good experience. We're not scary. We're the same as you. We're just using a different language. It would be no different than if you were trying to communicate with somebody who used a different spoken language than yourself. And write it down. It can be that simple. Just looking at the time, I know I've got to skip a few things. Sorry about that. We can always talk about that in the question period. So really the point is, and this is an illustration of two hands shaking, is it's the right thing to do. For communication equality, that's part of inclusive communication. And communication equality is a basic human right. Deaf people have to have access to the same information that hearing people do. The deaf community is a very close-knit community, and I would imagine that a word of a business providing more equitable work experience is going to spread. When you think of things like that, Amazon provides interpreters, they provide that access, so more deaf employees would go there. And honestly, that gives that business an edge, that competitive edge. Deaf people are hard workers. And there's an employer who's meeting their needs, and deaf people can be very productive workers. And I mean, it can be lonely when you've got all your co-workers talking around you, but you're there focused on your task, just doing your job. There are many amazing skilled deaf potential employees out there that should be hired. So for businesses, it's also just how to be better prepared and meet their industry needs, which can be quite varied, as well as your consumers and employees, and make it a more beneficial, better work environment than full of stress. Deaf people would really appreciate that. We have a varied experiences and stories. There's lots of deaf people who love watching our stories because we're so visual, which I don't quite get, but you can reach out to me for more inclusive communication training, my thoughts about design and access for all, because with access for all, everybody wins. Ooh, okay. I had other points, but I want you to have opportunities for your questions, and I can see the chat populating. So yeah, let me just get this off. Where is it?
So maybe I'll jump in with the first question. Just around, you mentioned that employers don't often know sign language or, haven't had a lot of training. Why do you suppose this is?
Do you mean the deaf people or the hearing employers?
The hearing employers.
They're not aware. Maybe they've never even met a deaf person in their life, so they just don't know. They don't know where to find the training. They've just never had that interaction with a deaf person before. So you've got to look and find the deaf businesses, the deaf individuals who provide that sort of training.
Fantastic. And, a question here from our audience. What would you say is sort of the biggest barrier facing people who are deaf in obtaining employment?
Communication. Many times, like I've mentioned, is on the resume, if the potential employer sees the word deaf, they're immediately resistant because they're not sure what the communication is. And I mean, we have grown up within the deaf community, accommodating everybody else. We've been trained how to speech read. We have been trained to utilize different hearing technologies, but the hearing people often have that fear and they don't know how to communicate. So that would be the biggest barrier and needs to be fixed.
I have a question for Leah. So Leah, you mentioned it in your presentation, but what do you think is the reality for employment for members of the deaf community? Is it similar to people who experience hearing loss?
Everybody has different experiences, but those who are culturally deaf and utilize sign language, maybe other individuals became deafened later in life. The best thing to do is to ask the individual their communication preference, because they probably have solutions ready. They may need interpreters for large meetings. You might be able to have a conversation through email where another person would prefer to speech read. They don't have an issue with that. So again, it's asking each individual the best way to communicate with them.
And Leah, I think this just brings up a question that I was thinking about during your presentation, because I'm Elizabeth Novak and I have low vision. So I wonder how I would communicate with somebody signing ASL as a visually impaired person, because it is a visual language. So maybe could you suggest some strategies for how deaf people and people who are blind or have low vision can communicate better and kind of break those communication barriers between them?
You could converse through text. There's also pro tactile, so a person could hold on to the hands while they're signing. To be legally blind, you might have to ask the person their preference to see what would work best. I met a blind person, so they couldn't see my signing space, but they could see outside of that. So I would have the interpreter, because their central vision was more blurry, but they had clearer peripheral. So the person actually sort of had to stand off to the side and move to be able to see, because where my eyes were, that was just blurry for that individual. So they actually had to move themselves to have a better sight line for them. But often you can text, because then you can enlarge the font on the screen and you can move the phone back and forth between each other. But again, everybody's different and everybody will have their own preference for communication styles.
We have some questions from our audience. Crystal and then Carlisle. So let's maybe start with Crystal.
Okay. So I've been taking an ASL class, so I've learned a lot of what you have talked about in my class, per se, with how ASL is its own language with the different grammar structure, and how important the face is. I'm going on to take a second class actually in the fall semester, but I did well in the first one. So I kind of wanted to say that. And I thought this talk was a good compliment to the class. So I took the link and basically sent it to the entire class, professor included. So
Thank you.
Since I can't see anybody else, I don't know exactly how many actually came. But there was 20 students in my class total, including myself.
Thank you. That's awesome. Typically, sometimes when teaching, that will include personal experiences, cultural deaf experiences when you're teaching. So that applies to your learning as well through the years, and definitely will help with the ASL.
Yes, and we did some deaf culture in that class too. So I saw a lot of what you were saying about the culture in that class as well.
Leah,
Awesome.
we have a question. When it comes to signing, I often hear that there are words that are needed to be spelled. How can we be mindful of this?
Some signs are spelled only because the community has not yet agreed upon a specific sign. Same within hearing, there might be a slang word that just starts with one or two people and slowly spreads. It's the same idea. So within deaf culture, like for bus, or you might show a vehicle and then and show that it's a long vehicle. If it's a word that's only 2 or 3 letters, we can spell that quickly. Same with your name, or my name is Leah. I can do that rather rapidly. And for the months as well, we don't spell the full thing, but you'll do like Jan, Feb, March, that sort of thing. So again, it's where things accommodate, and if there is a sign, we'll use that. Canadians may not have yet decided on a good sign, like for family, that you'll see often, but some others have decided that they want to sign family this way. But it hasn't been fully accepted within the community. But we'll look and see what fits within the Canadian context and the American context, and each country will utilize their own preference once the community has come to a consensus. Same within the hearing worlds. There's lots of new vocabulary that comes up. I mean, I'm out of the loop, but the kids know the new words and the new slang that's coming up. And I'm like, where is that from? What is that? And I try and find it online. And it's the same with sign too. As the community grows, signs change and vary. As well with technology, now we're more separated from each other. So you'll see more regionally. It's accepted within regions, but not as a whole consensus. So it takes a practice, and it takes time for the entire community to come up with a sign. Like if you think of a vegetable such as broccoli, which has no sign as of yet, some people will sign it as a green tree, but some people will just spell it because that's what is used in their area.
I want to say something to that because I've been trying to do countries, and I noticed that a lot of countries in the last few years had their signs changed.
Yes. Yes. And that is because some signs that were being used were racially inappropriate. I won't sign some of the older ones, like for Chinese, but it is now so China used to show a Mao jacket, but it is now being changed to this sign. But it is their country style sign. It is their symbol. So as their language starts to grow and spread, so Canada might adopt their sign. They may have their own sign for Canada as well. Like within Lansing Quebecois, you do a C showing across the country, but in ASL, it's the A tapping on your shoulder. Countries are varied in their signs, and it's still in process which countries will adopt which signs.
We have a question from TJ who says, I am a latent deaf individual who relies on ASL for clear understanding of verbal communication. Because I voiced the misconception is I could hear. I am always advocating and frustrated in the lack of acceptance. What do you recommend?
And I'm in the same boat. I speak as well, and there are struggles with those misconceptions. And best I can say is keep educating, or as well refer to an agency like myself that I can sort of pester them to provide that training and provide that awareness. I mean, we're deaf. You take that hearing aid off, you take a device off, and you're still deaf without it. So I know friends with different devices and they don't want to talk about it. They're just sick of it. So it's just getting out there and educating and exposing people. And again, just so many people are ignorant. They don't know. They've never met. They have their preconceived notions and assumptions. They've been exposed to the wrong information. So we need to reframe how they see deafness. It's not a negative. There are many gains for a deaf person. I have a litany that I could just go on and on about. So it's not just something that benefits the deaf community, it would benefit everybody. One thing I do notice, I did see somebody's comment, is when people make the comment of, wow, you speak really well. But I have practiced and practiced to get that skill. Society has this expectation of us that we must hear, we must speak clearly, we must lip read. But again, there's another language that's accessible that we can utilize.
We have a audience.
And it's just advocating and tolerance. I'm here to help.
Thank you so much, Leah. We have a audience participant named Carlisle who wants to ask a question.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. I am Carlisle, and I have a comment and a question. So, first of all, I just want to say this is a wonderful workshop, and it is so needed in Canada to have this information. And I don't think I've never met a deaf person who hasn't experienced employment discrimination or discrimination in the workplace. Can you imagine never meeting somebody who hasn't? Of over 40 applicants, as an artist in Canada, I have applied to so many different places and only got one response. And some say, "Are you Canadian?" I say, "Yes, I'm Canadian." "Oh, well, we're already over the limit of 40, so sorry." And so many of us deaf folks are working so hard just to get that basic dignity and that basic acceptance. And especially, and with me, I don't speak. So this is another even bigger challenge for me. So now this leads into my actual question for Leah. How do you think we could best continue to advocate? I mean, now I have a job, fortunately, and I have a job with a deaf organization. So
that's awesome.
And it's for LCB. And that's the safest space for me to have access and for me to work and be comfortable working there versus working for US companies or hearing companies where I'm not going to have the access. So, to my question for you is, how can we continue to advocate? Is it creating more networks, conferences, workshops, saying to hire interpreters? What do you think I can do and other deaf Canadians can do to continue to advocate?
That was beautiful. Yeah, I've worked with your organization before and provided some training and awareness. And if they're curious about more, you can contact me or and I can have other organizations as well that I can provide as resources and support to provide the events. Oh, wow. Woo. Yeah, I get you. I get it. I feel it. I am in the same thing. I've got the degrees. You've got me beat on that for some of them, but looking for work is hard and challenging. It's needing to step back and look. It's really very simple. It's so beautifully simple. It's not complex at all. It's just you need to study and learn and keep practicing and take the training. And we do provide training to help organizations and workplaces, as I've mentioned in my presentation, about assessments and trainings and coaching and working within the organization how to improve. Because sometimes it's just that little difference can make that space more deaf friendly, and bringing in people with lived experiencing. Same with any disability.
Exactly.
You bring in those people with that lived experience and you can see how to improve. And really, a small change can make a huge difference. You're right. It's the
Exactly.
training that's needed. And I do provide that sort of training, networking like this. There's different things you can do and looking for those opportunities.
Right. I agree with that so much. And even some organizations and companies hire a deaf person and they check the box. But are they going to let that deaf person be able to climb
Exactly.
that corporate ladder, right? Like they should have the
Yeah,
opportunity as well.
exactly. Exactly. You hit it right on the head.
Thank you.
We have all these degrees, all this training, and they're looking for, I know somebody who graduated, they had degrees, looked for work for 2 years, couldn't find anything. There was a company that finally hired them. They had trained 35 staff in order to interact with this new hire. They had weekly lessons, and now that person is treated as an equal with their peers. And it was because they had the communication opportunities. And that was my experience as well. For 8 years, I stayed at the same level, and all these new hires were coming in and moving up, and I wasn't going anywhere. So you have to look around and you have to break that glass ceiling. Thank you for that term, getting through that glass ceiling. Right.
There it is.
Thank you, Carla.
We have time for just one more question. And that is, I noticed hearing interpreters making up signs because they don't want to spell. How do we educate or re-educate the hearing interpreters not to create signs?
Interesting. Really, again, depending on the individual in the classroom. If it's educational and you're working with a student and the deaf student might make up a sign for within that classroom, but it wouldn't be applicable outside the classroom. But again, really, it depends on the individual that you're working with. If not, then you need to go above that interpreter, have a meeting, discuss ideas, why there's an issue, what's going on, and just keep working your way up, going through the channels, right? You start with the frontline staff, that doesn't work. You go up to supervisor, manager, same idea for interpreters. If they're making up a sign and the deaf person complains, then obviously there is an issue. So again, it's maybe even negotiating a sign. Courtney and I have done that before. It's like, okay, we don't have a sign for this, but we can't spell it all the time. So we might even come up with one part of a sign and then have an expansion for it. Like in a doctor's office, the doctor gives these huge medical terms, and it's like to the interpreter, can you ask for an expansion on that, what that is? And for then it's having the doctor wait while the interpreter puts out the expansion to make these medical terms more accessible and more comprehensible. As well, keep in mind, there is lag time. The interpreters are working between two different languages. Same with me. I don't know what my lag time was like, but most of the times you'll see on the presentation, you might see like how to sign some things. There's some tips. So the information is there in the PowerPoint. I did have plans to go through some scenarios and activities, but the questions are part of the scenarios as well. So it did work out quite well today.
Well, we're out of time, but I would like to thank our amazing guest speaker, Leah Riddell, for providing one of the most insightful, honest conversations
Thank you.
webinars that we've ever had. I think I've learned so much. And I would like to thank our amazing ASL interpreters, Christopher and Courtney, for providing excellent translation. And just so all of our webinar participants know, you will be getting an email with the slide decks, okay? And we will be putting a recording of this webinar up on our Discoverability Network YouTube channel, so you can come back and rewatch this presentation. So we thank you for joining us for a wonderful, honest conversations, and enjoy the rest of your week. Take care.
And reach out if you have any other questions. I'm happy to respond or provide support, training, workshops. Just reach out. And the same with the disability networks as well. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you.